I mean, we saw in July, the state failed, absolutely clearly, for days on end, people were looting and doing what they wanted, and there was no state, there was no army, there was no police. And you can't not believe in state failure when you've been through that. Now, I think that's the only way that you would get secession of the Cape or anything like that. That clearly, if the state was simply in such a powerless situation that it was unable to do anything to stop that, well, then obviously people who wanted to walk away would do so, and would, in a sense, be forced to do so because nobody else would be willing to take on the responsibilities of governance.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with R.V. Johnson. Bill is a British journalist, political scientist, and historian who resides in South Africa. He was educated at Natal University, Oxford University, and he is a Rhodes Scholar. Between 1995 and 2001, he was the director of the Helen Suzman Foundation, and he is currently a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, where he has taught for 26 years. Bill is the author of many books, such as How Long Will South Africa Survive?, Fighting for the Dream, and For a Native, an account of his life in Africa. Bill, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
So, Bill, we've just had a very historic local election result with the ANC for the first time falling below 50%. What is your opinion of this result? Was it a political earthquake?
I don't think so, no. It was part of a process of decline of the ANC vote. It just happened to go below the 50 mark this time, but it was a matter of time before that happened. The question really, the decline seems to have accelerated. So the big question is, will this continue? And if it does at the same speed, then clearly the whole coherence and unity of that party is at stake. It was a very bad result. I think the key point really was that when I was doing opinion surveys for the last general election in 2019, we did try and test what sort of effect Ramaphosa had on the ANC vote. And we found that there were 11% of voters who were basically fed up with the ANC and didn't trust it, but who said they did have confidence in Ramaphosa and would therefore support the ANC. In other words, he was making that difference. It would have gone below 50 in that election, but for his personal effect. Now, it suggests that although he's still quite popular, that his ability to prop the party up has considerably diminished, and that that sort of special factor seems to have gone or be down to a very small level.
Why do you think that's the case, that he's managed to distance himself from his party, that he is more popular than his party? How does he achieve that?
Well, I think that it was true probably of all the presidents. We don't have comparable data for all of them. I'm sure it was true for Mandela, that he was more popular than the party, and I suspect it was for Mbeki. So I don't know about Zuma though, but certainly it's what I would expect, because the president is, the key personalities. He's in the forefront of one's imagination and all reporting and so forth. So he's a larger than life figure for most people, and they have opinions about him much more than they do about the party usually. So that, and this is well known in other presidential systems too. De Gaulle was always far more popular than the Gaullists and so forth. And very often it's been true in America. So that's not unusual in itself, but what one tends to find in such systems is that as a process of what sociologists call routinization takes place, so that over time, you know, that margin, which is the presidential margin, does tend to diminish because, after all, he's not a magic man, and he is identified with the successes and failures of the government at the end of the day. So the longer it goes on, the more he tends to, the two figures will come together. And that's certainly what's been happening here.
Well, that's fascinating. And I believe another interesting thing to watch will be the next ANC conference in 2022. Who do you believe will be elected as the deputy president there and eventually succeed Ramaphosa? What do you think will happen there?
Well, it's quite difficult to say because the current occupant, David Mabuza, doesn't really seem to be much of a prospect. He's got a reputation as a crook. There are even books showing that he was and possibly still is a crook. And his health hasn't been very good. And there seems to be discontent with him as a deputy president, even inside the ANC. So I think there's a general supposition that they'll have to come up with somebody different. Now, I think that would have been Zweli Mkhize, because for fairly obvious reasons, it would be useful to have a Zulu, particularly if the central presidential office is having continuous trouble with KwaZulu-Natal, which it looks like it will while Zuma's still around. So it would be good to have a heavyweight Zulu who, like Zweli, had been premier of the province and had a following of his own. But he has messed that up because of the Digital Vibes affair, which in that sense, I think, you know, he was well positioned otherwise. He'd been quite good as far as the electorate was concerned over the COVID. And they liked the idea that he was a qualified doctor and he had a certain gravitas. But by the Digital Vibes affair, it's very strange because quite clearly his family benefited from that, particularly his son. And in a sense, he seems to have chosen to steal a bit now rather than wait until becoming president when he could have stolen a lot more. So he sort of seems to have really knocked himself out of the reckoning. So I suppose that the most likely person after that is Paul Mashatile, because he's known to be ambitious. He would be young enough to do so. He's already Treasurer General, one of the top 6. But there's a problem, which is if you look at it, all the presidents to date have had some sort of struggle record. Mandela, obviously, Mbeki in the exiled ANC, Zuma in MK and exile, and Ramaphosa even as a trade unionist and UDF leader. And we would now go, in other words, into completely new territory, somebody who has got no struggle record to speak of at all, and who therefore doesn't have any national profile. I mean, the others, if you think of it, all the presidents we've had to date were famous men before 1994. We've been using up that, the ANC has failed to renew itself. It's been relying on the people who were famous before 94, and it's now running out of those. And I'm not sure how well Mashatile could do in this role because he's really only known in Gauteng. He's a Shangaan, which is not a very large group, and has some of the same problems as being a vendor, which Ramaphosa has. I mean, it's quite obvious that, you know, if you know KwaZulu-Natal, you know that Zulus will never take very kindly to being ruled by a vendor. It's just a big problem. And
why is that?
Well, it goes all the way back to, I mean, if you ask Zulu people about that, they'll go into things about what happened in the time of Shaka and say the vendor would run away if the Zulu MPs came and this sort of thing. Literally, they would make remarks like that. So, I mean, I think that is a problem, and I suspect that it's affected Ramaphosa's self-confidence, and it's why he dithers and is indecisive and so forth. I think he knows that he doesn't have the I mean, look, the dominant group in this country are the Nguni people, Zulu Xhosa, and in a sense, it's easier if the president comes from that group. but we've now stepped outside that group with Ramaphosa, and if it were Mashatile, we'd do it again.
That's interesting. What do you think of the chances of a person like Thande Modise, the former Speaker of the House, the current Minister of Defense, a woman? She has a struggle record. Don't you think perhaps Ramaphosa elevated her to the position of Minister of Defense to get her into the position of Deputy President?
Well, it's possible, but I hadn't thought of it truthfully. Look, the ANC has been very much a male preserve always. There's never been a woman leader picked. So all I can say is it would be very, very new territory if they really did go that way. I would be surprised.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting experiment because many of their voters are conservative. But if we can pivot to a very interesting article you wrote about the Freedom Front Plus, you said that a lot of English white South Africans love the idea or are very interested in the ideas of the Freedom Front Plus, which are federalism, Cape independence, conservatism, but they are not comfortable voting for the party because it has that sort of national party brand, affiliate brand. What do you think the Freedom Front Plus can do to get over that? Or can you explain what you wrote in that article?
Well, I take it when you say English white, you mean English speaking, not actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Equally, there's no such thing as a National Party affiliate because the National Party doesn't exist, but it hasn't done for 20 odd years. But I take it, I understand what you're saying. Well, look, I think that what I was saying about that is that a lot of English-speaking whites in South Africa, and I mean, I think that they're particularly prominent in the sort of Cape independence movement. They're rather apolitical people or non-political people, and they probably would have been United Party in the old days. And I think the problem is that the Freedom Front, rather like Solidarity and AfriForum, put themselves forward very much in an Afrikaans way. And quite clearly, the feeling is there, one, that the Afrikaans nation is threatened, as it was after the Anglo-Boer War, and that they've really got to stand together to get through this trial, which they are now undergoing. And to that extent, it's deliberate. I mean, there are a lot of English speakers who are sympathetic, particularly to Solidarity AfriForum, and rather admire it. But AfriForum and Solidarity always behave as if that's not of much interest to them, you know, and they're far more willing to take up the cause of Afrikaans-speaking colored people than white English speakers. But obviously, if they did decide, and the Freedom Front decided that they wanted to go that route, then they would need some English speakers in their leadership. And at the moment, there aren't such people. Mind you, having said that, after I wrote that article, I was quite struck by the fact that a number of English-speaking whites that I came across made the point that that wouldn't stop them supporting them, that they had a good opinion of them and so forth. And one has to keep one's eye on that because we live in an age of racial polarization. It's a very unfortunate fact, but it's true that the more this government fails, the more you get white people reverting to sort of primary racist attitudes, saying Africans are hopeless, always will be, etc., etc. I mean, I see it all the time, and it's very unfortunate because those attitudes were very common in the apartheid era, but they then vanished in the new South Africa during the Rainbow Nation phase, and everyone was much relieved, I think, and it was genuinely progress that we got beyond those sort of attitudes. So it's rather disappointing to see them back again. But it's, I think, you know, the sheer failure of the ANC government and the failure of the economy and all the things that go with that are exerting great pressure on people, and this is how they respond.
So it can be as simple as just getting more English-speaking South Africans into your party.
if that's what they want. As I say, I'm not sure that they want it, but if they do, that's what they would need to do. They'd have to have some prominent English speakers in their leadership. Yeah.
Another party that seems to struggle with the image of being only a white party is the DA, under the leadership now of John Steenhuisen and Helen Zille. Do you think there's anything that they can do against that image created by the media, or is it just a foregone conclusion that they are now a party for minorities, whites in particular?
No, there's no foregone conclusion. I mean, the story never ends, as it were. But look, in a society like this one, where racial polarization is a fact, and where indeed the dominant party has now only that to rely on, you know, it's got to use it because it can't say we're doing a grand job of governing the country, look how well the economy is doing, etc. All they've got left is appealing to racial solidarity, so they will. And after all, they come from the 80% group, and that's their only winning ticket. So it's a difficult thing to put together a truly multiracial party in a racially polarized electorate. But it's not impossible. And indeed, the DA was making good progress in that direction until 10 or so years ago. And then I think they lost the plot in several different ways, which I can go into if you want. But I think that the problems they've got now are the result of their own mistakes, and that they didn't need to make those mistakes. They were just bad errors.
How did they lose the plot? Was it the mistakes of Musi Maimane?
No, before that, under Zille. Look, two things. First, they began to move to become what was generally called ANC light. Their policies moved in that direction. Now, I think that was a very bad decision by Zille because, look, it's a bit like I was living in England at the time when the Scottish nationalists first rose to prominence in the 1970s. And, you know, what you then found was that Labour and the Liberals particularly immediately changed policy so as to agree that there must be a Scottish Parliament. Now, this I think was very foolish of them, because if that's what you want, if you want devolution to a more federal system, well, first of all, by coming out with that, you are legitimating what the Scottish nationalists say. And secondly, if that's what you're keen on, why not vote for the SNP rather than Labour or Liberals? That's the real thing, the real McCoy, you know. So, I mean, at the end of that sort of bidding war over this, you end up with the Scottish Parliament, which has almost 100% SNP people in it, and Labour wiped out in Scotland. I mean, it's no good being a Me Too party, because if that's what you're being, you know, if all the girls want to look like Marilyn Monroe, then the boys will go for Marilyn Monroe, because that's the real thing, you know. And so it's a bad idea, and they should have kept their specifically liberal focus that they had, and which been so successful under Tony Leon. That was very big error one. And you actually used to come across young DA MPs in that period who would say, I don't know what the principles of the party are anymore. I mean, what a situation to get into. But secondly, they went in for identity politics, where they would get hold of particularly African people, though not only, also, of course, Patricia DeLille, and recruit them into the party and almost immediately give them absolutely top jobs. This happened. I mean, you know, Zille brought in Mompela Rampele and tried to make her the party's presidential candidate. She wouldn't even join the party, for God's sake. And this was done with Lindiwe Mazibuko. It was later done with Maimane. It was done with Mashaba, who had no history in the DA at all. Now, in every case, what you're doing is you're taking people with no record or history in that party, no traditional loyalty to it, and by jumping them to the top, we've seen this, of course, over and over again in South Africa. It's affirmative action stuff. What you basically say to them is, you don't have to go through the normal career building phase. we're going to jump you straight to the top of the queue, and maybe you will be the leader of the party. And, you know, people that you do that to usually believe that this isn't affirmative action, it's due to their own extraordinary merit. And it tends to make them rather difficult and rather demanding and so forth. And then, of course, if they don't cut it, you've got a big problem, because you build them right up. They will be extremely offended if you demote them at all. And then they peel off and start other competing parties, which take away your vote. And that the DA has done all of those things. And it was first of all, it was ridiculous to think that you could simply get African votes by putting in a couple of Africans, jumping them to the top like that. But above all, what they needed to do, of course, they needed to recruit people from all racial groups, but they needed then to make them do what everyone else had to do, which is to earn their spurs in the normal way. And first of all, become an MP or a councillor, whatever it is, and then slog through being on this committee and that committee. And then if they're good enough, make them an opposition spokesman and see how they do with that. And then try them in a more ambitious portfolio. And this is what happens normally, so that somebody who gets to the front has had 10 or more years working at the coalface and is now a committed party person and so forth. And they're not going to run away if they get disappointed. They know they're in for the long haul. That's what they should have done. But they were in a hurry because they thought that, you know, if we've got somebody, a prominent African by the next election, we'll get African votes. Well, it's not that simple. Anyway, the result was disastrous. And what it meant was that they had been gaining at every election, election after election. They had a wonderful feeling of momentum and optimism, which ran through all their supporters, and they spoilt it. And they lost that momentum. And I think their supporters are very resentful of this and in a bad temper with the party. You came across it a lot in the last elections, that they were not in a good mood at all, and that even party regulars would tell you that they were worried because would people bother to vote, and they were, you know, they were fed up. And this, I'm afraid, was all self-inflicted damage. It need not have happened. And it's a difficult thing to build a multiracial party, but they were doing it jolly well until they started on these things. And now, of course, they want to turn around and reverse themselves. Well, okay, fine, they've learned their lesson, but what an expensive education that was. And it'll be very, very difficult now. They've got to stop the rot and then turn it all around. And that's not easy. And, you know, momentum is a precious thing, and they threw it away.
That's fascinating. So can you say many of these former leaders or members of the Democratic Alliance, like Lindiwe Matsabuku, Musi Maimane, the reason why they are so bitter is because they were promised the world and they didn't get it. They were promised the world.
Yes. Look, I mean, you've got to remember back in the 1970s and 80s, Colin Eglin was the party leader. And then up came Francel Slabbert, who was obviously very charismatic, very popular. And so they went to Eglin and said, listen, Colin, a lot of people would like Francel to be leader. Would you step down? Now, this wasn't very nice for him, but he said, oh, all right. And he did. And they made Slabbert leader, and Eglin carried on loyally in the sort of leadership team under Slabbert. And then when Slabbert finally left, they turned around to Eglin and said, would you be leader again? And he said, oh, all right. Now, you see, that's what a party loyalist does. He doesn't, I mean, when they told Musi to stand down, he immediately leaves the party and supports its opponents. I mean, there's no loyalty there at all, because there's no history in the party, you know. And I think that this was just a huge mistake in the way that they did this accelerated promotion. And they even had this program for young up-and-comers in the party called the Future Leaders Program. Now, this is a dreadful idea, to take a mainly brown and black group of people, to tell them in advance, you are future leaders. Now, first of all, this sends a terrible message to people who are white or Indian or whatever, because there aren't many of them in that group. You know, you're telling them why bother with a parliamentary career. But secondly, it's absolutely dangerous and absurd to tell young people in advance that you are our future leaders. You are building up their expectations to a level that you will not really be able to fulfill. And you've got to let them look. If it's always been true for white politicians who had better life chances and better educations and so forth, that they had to earn their spurs by slogging away for years on the back benches or whatever before they got to leadership position, why should you decide that for people who've had many less advantages that you can skip all that? It's completely ridiculous. And the truth is that it was done for short-term electoral reasons, and it shouldn't have been. It was a very big and very naive mistake.
Absolutely. Can one say Helen Zille is one of the main reasons why the DA is struggling at the moment, and it would be best if she retired from politics?
Well, I know a lot of people do feel that, and I think that that opinion has probably hardened over the period, because look, she has many merits, of course. She's energetic and she's intelligent and so on, but I think she's been there more than long enough, and she's now over 70, you know. But above all, I think she makes it very difficult for John Steenhuisen. I mean, I noticed when you introduced the subject, you talked about their two leaders, you know. Well, that wouldn't have happened when she was leader. It would have just been the one leader, wouldn't it? Or with Tony Leon or whatever. But in effect, there's this dual leadership structure. And the polls show that Steenhuisen doesn't have the name recognition or the general respect which comes from being the sole leader. And I think it just makes it very difficult for him. And that, you know, particularly since Helen tends to, you know, put herself in the front row, as it were. I mean, there's a story in the Sunday Times saying that the DA are double-crossing Mashaba. It's not Steenhuisen who answers that, it's Zille. Now, when James Self was the chairman, he wouldn't have said a word. It would have been left to the leader to do that, you know. But Helen charges in and tends to put herself forward as the main voice of the party. And that, I think, is very difficult for Steenhuisen.
Speaking of ActionSA, I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised with the result in Gauteng and cities like Johannesburg and Pretoria. What do you think is the appeal and the future of a party like ActionSA with its leader, Herman Mashaba?
Well, I think that that's quite a difficult question for several reasons. One is that we have seen, of course, both with COPE, UDM and so forth, parties which have one promising election and then fade. So we don't yet know whether that will happen to Action South Africa. But what the situation which we faced in the elections which just finished is that the governing party had lost popularity. People were very fed up with it indeed. And yet, on the other hand, for various reasons, the main opposition wasn't also that popular. And there was therefore a bit of a gap. There needed to be something else. Now, in many cases, people voted for local parties or whatever, independents, whatever it was, you know, but they looked for another solution to that question. But in the shape of Mashaba, in Gauteng at least, there was a ready-made alternative for you. He was prominent, he'd been mayor and so forth. But I think the problem with Action South Africa is that it's far too much about one person. It's about Mashaba and the myth of his wealth. And I say myth because it's always put out that he really made his money by, you know, simple entrepreneurialism, whereas actually his money did come from BEE, which is a less dramatic way. And secondly, you know, it's been clear in the negotiations that Mashaba that the whole point of the party and of his whole political action for him is to become mayor again. So the Action South Africa has been negotiating, even though their party got fewer votes than, say, the DA, they wanted their man to be mayor again. And it's as if the whole thing is a personal vehicle for him to become mayor. Now, I don't think he will become mayor again because the DA don't seem keen to advance him, and why should they be? And the ANC will certainly want their own guy. So, you know, I think that project will not actually happen. And the other side of it, of course, is that Mashaba has the advantage of speaking out very plainly on the issue of foreign immigration to South Africa and saying that he's against it and so on. Now, that is a powerful issue. There's no doubt at all that he speaks for a large number of people when he says that. And, you know, I was in England at the time when Enoch Powell had his great success over that issue. And what had happened was that the elite, parliamentary elite, Labour and Conservative and Liberal, had all carefully looked the other way. They didn't want to take up the issue because it sounded racist and so on. But then finally, when Powell took it up, there was this huge sort of mushrooming of support for him, because at last there was someone saying what was actually a very key issue in the pubs and clubs, you know, on the street. And that in the same way, as we all know, that this is an issue which does agitate the street, and no one speaks for it now except Mashaba. And I think that that's a very powerful factor. Of course, he gets called a racist and all sorts of things for it, but it's a plus factor for his party, there's no doubt. But I think that it will be difficult because his party, its whole identity is to do with him. It's very much a provincial reputation and even a Joburg reputation. And it's not clearly making anything like the same inroads outside Gauteng as in that area. And as I say, he's not going to be mayor again. So it will be difficult for them to maintain their momentum and their impact. So I think it'll be, you know, the next couple of years will be interesting to see whether that party can sustain itself.
Definitely. And yeah, I also believe anti-illegal immigration stance is much more powerful than most political analysts believe. Why do you think that's not reflected in polling? Why don't more people say that illegal immigration is an issue to them?
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen much polling data about this. Look, whenever I've had that question in, there's been quite a considerable response. There's no doubt that it has, as they say, valence. It has weight and strength, that issue. There's no doubt about it. But I suppose, you know, the fact that everyone regards it as sort of politically incorrect has made it harder. But you can't get rid of it. And it would be true in any society where you've got very high unemployment and at the same time millions of people from outside that country are in the country competing for jobs. I mean, that is bound to produce huge social and political friction. It would in the UK, it would in France, it would anywhere that I know. And you can't possibly expect it not to. It's just bound to be so.
Absolutely. So, Bill, what do you think the future holds for South Africa? What do you think will happen in South Africa by 2030? Will we see a breakup of South Africa? Will we see something like Cape Independence? What will happen?
Well, we don't know, but one can have various scenarios. And of course, the most obvious scenario is that things will carry on as they are now. So one has to regard that as a possible scenario. And when one says that, what I mean is that a government which basically doesn't do very much, which is rather becalmed, which presides over very high unemployment, a very poor law and order. But the problem is, of course, that things don't stand still. And even if the ANC would like them to, they still won't. And as we can see, politically, they're losing ground, and it does seem likely that they will continue to do so. And the outlook economically is not good, so that one could see unemployment rising still further. And on the law and order front, I think that you know, the Front-Croniers scenario was one of which there are sort of, that in the cities, increasingly they'll be run by gangs, and that in the countryside by pretty authoritarian chiefs. And then outside that, you will get a bubble in which middle-class whites and the middle classes of other groups try to continue to exist in a fairly comfortable way, and that their world will be the world of their suburbs and their local shopping center and so forth. But that outside of that bubble, life will be very rough and tough indeed. And one can see that, you know, things are moving in that direction. There's no doubt about it. And the way that the Ingonyama Trust has been behaving, you know, more or less extorting rents from ordinary Zulu people for land that they would normally have got free, granted by the chiefs. I mean, it's exactly what he was talking about, you know, the chiefs becoming more rapacious and so forth and using their leverage. So, I mean, that's obviously one scenario which we are drifting towards, but there are several other scenarios. One is obviously the one which I've written about, which is that as our debt, which is still increasing, and the amount of interest we pay is still increasing, that if that goes beyond a certain point, then we will end up with the need for an IMF bailout. And now an IMF bailout would be a sort of Gotterdammerung, because the conditions would certainly include liberalization of the labor laws, which would effectively abolish COSATU and probably the SACP, the cutting of both the numbers and the wages of the public service, which would create huge trouble on that front, and undoubtedly the privatization of many state-owned enterprises. Now, as you can see, that would split the ANC into those who were willing to accept such a deal and those who weren't. And it would produce absolutely enormous political fallout. But of course, if you get to a point where you need an IMF loan, you can't really argue, you have to follow the conditions. So if that were to happen, then there's no doubt that there would be a major political change in the whole situation. And a whole lot of things which at the moment are on the back boiler would, you know, come to the boil and get dealt with. It's possible, of course, though unlikely, that the ANC, in order to stop that from happening, would carry out its own internal reform program, which would include the privatization of a number of the big SOEs. Now, you see, that's a very important thing, because at the moment, it's quite clear that the SOEs are all pleading for money and they need more capital, whether you're talking about the ports or the railways or Eskom or all of them, the land bank, etc., post office, you name it, they're all desperate for money and on the edge of going bust and so on. Now, the government doesn't have that money and is saying that it won't provide it, in which case the only way you can get that money is to bring in the private sector. And in that sense, privatization is the absolutely obvious thing that now ought to be happening with state-owned enterprises. But as we know, the political veto against that from COSATU, SACP, etc., is very, very strong. And it would be huge political ructions if you go that route. Mind you, it's happening with SAA, and maybe it has to happen. But I just doubt that the ANC will have the unity or the strength to take on such a tough issue and carry it through and force it through. But that is obviously a possible way out. And of course, finally, one could indeed see the breakdown of the order we live in and the breakdown of the state. State is obviously very weak now. And I mean, we saw in July, the state failed. Absolutely, clearly, for days on end, people were looting and doing what they wanted. And there was no state, there was no army, there was no police. And you can't not believe in state failure when you've been through that. Now, I think that's the only way that you would get secession of the Cape or anything like that. That clearly, if the state was simply in such a parlous situation that it was unable to do anything to stop that, well, then obviously people who wanted to walk away would do so and would, in a sense, be forced to do so because nobody else would be willing to take on the responsibilities of governance. And that is, it's a dramatic scenario, but it cannot be ruled out altogether now because we have seen the state get steadily weaker and fail in many respects. So those are the big four scenarios. As for which of those is going to happen, it's difficult to say. I would say that the most likely is the first one where you try to soldier on, but the trouble is that, first of all, the ANC is losing support. And secondly, in order to stand still, they now need to carry out some of these reforms, possibly including privatization. And I don't know whether they can face up to that. And lots of other things are going wrong at the same time, particularly now water. I mean, it's bad enough to have the electricity situation, but if water becomes as big a problem as it might, then, that really is a big thing. People go crazy when they're deprived of water very quickly. I've seen it in Natal, and wow, there were areas which I knew down the south of Natal where there was no water, and they would simply stone all the cars that came through, just show their anger with the situation, and whole areas would get blocked off by the police because people are going crazy because they don't have water. And, they don't do that over electricity, but water can produce very, very violent reaction. And I think also, to be quite frank, the failures over sewage are, sooner or later, if we keep on having sewage flowing in the streets, you're going to get some sort of epidemic from that, which will be a self-caused epidemic, not COVID, but, one of our own. And so all of these things are sitting in the wings, and could happen. So that, and of course, we've also got the situation in the big cities, certainly in Joburg and certainly in Durban, where the city government has failed so badly that those cities are sort of falling to pieces. And, we don't, that also could reach dramatic proportions. This is not like the rest of Africa. This is not a rural cash crop economy. This is not Ghana. This is a place where the bulk of the population lives in the big cities. And if you can't make those cities work tolerably, then there will be real trouble. And, we do look as if we're heading that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people talk about a shortage of food, but like you said, water is also a massive problem if you have a shortage of water. But I believe another scenario you mentioned in your book is a bailout by the Chinese.
No, not really. I don't take that very seriously. Actually, I don't think the Chinese would have any wish to do that. And they're not trying to compete with the IMF as a sort of coming to the rescue and dishing out hard conditions. It's not a fun game to be in. And I don't see why they would want to do that. And it's not something that I regard as a very serious possibility. But look, I don't know about food shortage. Our agriculture is wonderfully productive and just had a fantastically good year and is exporting a lot. provided they don't do anything really crazy like Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, i.e. leave the productive farmers to farm, then we can produce enough food. We shouldn't be short of food. Of course, the problem is price, because with so many people unemployed, can they afford the food that's in the shops is more the question, really. But we can produce enough food.
Yeah, sorry, I was talking more about inflation. Then it will be a shortage in terms of you can't afford the food. But there seems to be a lot of pressure on the DA to hold a referendum in the Western Cape on Cape independence. Do you think there's a possibility that that referendum will win in terms of the leave vote will win to secede from South Africa?
Well, hang on, before you get to that, I think in order to hold such a referendum, first of all, I think the central government would have to agree to it, and I can't see them agreeing to it. Secondly, it would be a big problem for the DA because the DA has kept quiet on that issue because it still has ambitions as a national party, and the bulk of its votes are in Gauteng. That's where the biggest single block of DA votes is. So they have no wish to take up the issue of Cape independence. Jordan Hill-Lewis carefully in his campaign talked about doing more and of obviously having a greater degree of autonomy and more of a city-state, basically. But he didn't use that word, and he was careful. He was appealing to the independence vote without using the word. And that was a perfectly sensible thing to do. But I don't think the DA is going to be in a hurry to hold such a referendum. I think if you did manage to hold such a referendum, it would have a reasonable chance of passing. I mean, the last poll we saw said 58% wanted a referendum. And usually people want a referendum when they want to vote for that thing. You know, anyway, that's been true in Scotland. But, and I think that the pro-independence people have rather altered the way they campaign. And they now particularly say, look, South Africa's a mess. We don't want to go down with the ship. We want to get off that before something terrible happens. That's quite a potent line. So that issue won't go away. And of course, the contrast between the Cape and the rest of the country gets increasingly strong. And I mean, you know, we're now, if cities are allowed to generate their own power, obviously that's an expensive thing. Cape Town's got the money to do it. Most of the metros don't. So you could easily imagine a situation where Cape Town alone has electricity and the rest of the country doesn't. Now, I mean, you know, once you get a contrast like that, good heavens, I mean, all the businesses will move to the Cape and so will the people, and, you know, and I don't think the ANC can afford that contrast. You know, it's just too awful for them. It reminds me of, you know, in Zimbabwe, they used to say during power cuts, oh, thank God we've got candles. What did we do before we had candles? And people would say electricity. And, you know, if you put it as starkly as that, say, you know, that voting ANC means candles and voting DA means having electricity, well, you can see what that would do. But I think that issue will not go away. The contrast is too great, and the fear of a further slide is also very strong. So, you know, it's there.
Do you also think we can have a similar situation like with the SNP in the UK, where more federalism to the Western Cape will only enable it to advocate for independence more because they become more powerful in federalism? They become more successful as they become more federal.
Well, that isn't a given. I mean, for example, they're campaigning saying they would like to have their own police force and to take over responsibility for the railways, hardly work at all. Now, you know, that's a big ask. If they were to take over the railways, can they make them work? You know, it's a big if. So, I mean, and, you know, again, this has hurt the SNP in Scotland, because if you look at them as simply how good are they at running Scotland, the answer is not very good, actually. It's all very well talking a lot about symbolic issues like independence and waving the flag and singing the song and all the rest of it. But, you know, how good are you at running things is a different question. And I think that, so it would be a big test for them. But certainly, if they did manage to do those things successfully, it would certainly increase the appetite for more of the same. Yeah.
So, Bill, I mentioned in the intro you were a former director of the Helen Suzman Foundation. I saw a very interesting video of Floyd Shivambu saying in a panel discussion in Parliament that Helen Suzman was part of the apartheid machinery. She didn't do much to stop apartheid. She was part of it. Is he right? I don't believe he is, but obviously you will know the best answer to that. Who was Helen Suzman, and did she do enough to stop apartheid?
Frankly, that opinion is just, I don't think Floyd Shivambu knows any history at all, really. And that if you did, you know that nobody did more. She was endlessly active and energetic, and even the ANC relied upon her absolutely, because, you know, if you, I mean, I was in England for some of that time, and the ANC, when they were putting out propaganda for their party, if you looked at it, it was tremendously reliant on the data which Helen Suzman got with her parliamentary questions. She got, because the Nats were pretty good at providing information. If you put down a question, they did answer it, which is not true of the current government. But Helen was a thorn in their flesh, and she, you know, and she went to the prisons and got their conditions improved, and Mandela and the prisoners, they thought the world of her for that. Nobody else did that. And, you know, it is just simply ridiculous to say she was part of the apartheid machinery. It's just absolute nonsense. And I suppose the reason why Floyd Shivambu says something like that is that in the mental and intellectual world of the EFF, it is annoying to have white South Africans who are rather heroic figures for what they did. And they would therefore like to pour shit on them or whatever, you know. And I can see it's a rather childish thing to do, but it's completely ridiculous, of course. And, you know, she was tireless, she was brave, and I knew her well, and, you know, it was a completely ridiculous thing to say.
She also brought the international attention to the issue of apartheid to all the countries in the world.
I think she did to a considerable degree, and everyone was very taken with the drama of this single woman taking on the entire apartheid government. And, you know, she had a hard time. A lot of the National Party MPs were very anti-Semitic and very rude and brutal towards her and so forth. And mind you, she always said that she owed a great deal to this man Klopper, who was the speaker, because he treated her very fairly. And when she stood up wanting to make a speech, he would always recognize her. And he took the view that she may only be one person, but she represents a whole school of thought. So it's very important to hear what she's got to say. And she said, you know, you depend entirely on that. If you refused to recognize me, I wouldn't have had half the chances I got. So, I mean, the truth is that the parliamentary system worked rather well in that sense, you know. But certainly she got a lot of international attention as well, and honorary degrees around the world and all that sort of thing. And quite rightly so, you know. And no one else was able to do those things. You know, it was very important to have somebody in Parliament getting that information, pushing the Nats, going and visiting the prisons, getting the publicity and so on. And no one else could do that. She did it.
Absolutely. And yeah, Bill, pivoting to the last question, I want to ask you, this has been a fascinating conversation. Last question I want to ask you is that you've written an article critical of South Africa's immigration stance, um, in terms of allowing a lot of young people, I believe, into the country. It's not positive to have a lot of young people in the country looking towards the future. Can you explain what you wrote in that article?
No, I wasn't really concentrating so much on their youth, but look, it does seem to me that every country in the world has the right to control its own immigration policy. It's part of national sovereignty that you should be able to do so. And we don't really seem to do that. Our borders are open, we don't really control them, and we do have very large numbers of illegal immigrants. And as you know, this is a major social problem and political problem and so on, which we don't actually need to have. But of course, a lot of it derived from Thabo Mbeki's support of Mugabe. If the ANC had taken a decent line on that issue back in 2000 and basically forced through democracy in Zimbabwe, just like they had here, then that problem would have been dealt with and we wouldn't have had all these millions of Zimbabweans pouring down here. That was an unnecessary self-inflicted wound, but there we go. Look, I think the point I was making in a more general sense was that if you look around Africa, that the birth rates, which basically as a result of colonial medicine, and therefore, much lower rates of infant mortality and people living much longer lives, that we have had very rapid increases in population. And we know that by the year 2050, there are going to be at least another 1 billion Africans. Now, many African states are not coping as it is. Many of them are at war, civil war, or whatever. It seems to me absolutely obvious that they are not going to be able to cope with that extra population. They will not be able to provide it with housing, jobs, education, etc., etc. And it will overwhelm them. And that, look, having lots of vigorous young people in your population is jolly nice if you've got the jobs to give them. But if you haven't, then you've got a big problem. And most wars and revolutions depend on there being lots of unemployed young men. It tends to be a very explosive factor if you are not able to provide them with the basics. And a lot of those states are not going to be able to. And I do think that that is a big issue for us, because if we continue to have open borders, then we will get more and more people coming from this overwhelming population explosion which is going on in the rest of Africa. And our own population will not be tolerant of that. We know that, we've seen it already. So I just think that we need to think of these things, and we need to decide, what sort of population size we want, and we need to control our borders. And I don't think that that is in any way a illegitimate objective. I think any national state in the world can have that objective, and you can't complain. It's just part of national sovereignty.
What do you think would be a more sensible immigration approach, allowing skilled labor from first world countries easier access to your country?
Well, it doesn't matter whether it comes from developed countries or not, but we're very short of skills. So certainly we need skilled labor. The last thing we need is more unskilled labor. We've got plenty of that, thank you, far too much. So it is ridiculous to be allowing more unskilled labor to pour into the country. And, you see it. If you take Australia or many countries in the world now, they have these quota systems where they say, we're short of computer programmers and doctors and nurses and so on, but we don't need any more stevedores or whatever it is, and that's accepted as a normal way of running an immigration policy. Well, obviously, we ought to have our own equivalent of that. And we ought to be very pleased if we can get skilled people from anywhere, wherever they may come from, you know. If they come from Ghana or Nigeria, that's as good as coming from Britain or America. It doesn't matter. But so I think we certainly ought to limit immigration in terms of skills. That's undoubtedly so.
Mm. Well, Bill, thank you so much for your time. There's been absolutely wise perspectives that you've given our audience. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
No, really, I'm happy. It's up to you to put the questions. I'm not going to ask myself questions.
Okay, well, great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for your time, and to our viewers. If you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing this widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.